Thank you all. We're going to call our meeting back into session. And our next item on the agenda is the overview of redistricting, which I think we're all kind of like experts at this point, but Jason's going to get us right. So Jason Reynolds, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself again? And
Madam Chair, can I just chime in and say these next two presentations are presentations. They're not discussions. We can change them. It is what it is. Just want to be clear.
But they're definitely highly important information topics, so please pay attention.
Yes, good evening again, committee members. My name is Jason Reynolds. I'm the manager of the Neighborhood Services Division. I'm the one who's been emailing you and calling you, and I will be continuing to do that. Are you hearing me better now? Okay, great. So I'll be doing what I would consider a brief presentation. Those of you who have watched the presentations I've sent, which would have been done at the BCC, this will mirror some of that information. This is our outline. I'll start with the background, discuss the resolution a little bit more, and then conclude with some of the data. Redistricting is very simply adjusting the county commission's boundaries. It occurs every 10 years, and it's based on the most recent census. Obviously, 2020 was a census year. COVID-19 lengthened the census campaign by 6 months, which in turn delayed some of the data being released to where we are now. The redistricting process is mandated by the Florida Constitution and the Orange County Charter. That's important to realize. The committee which you are today reviews the census data, analyze proposed plans for commission district boundaries. It's created by a resolution. It consists of 15 members. The mayor appoints 3 people, and each commissioner appoints 2 people. This group, as you are today, will recommend plans, also known as maps, to the BCC for final approval. The timeline, which we see here, is 9 public meetings between September and December. There will be 3 meetings in the administration building here. You've all been sent the dates of those meetings. The locations are being filled in as we speak. Then it's 1 meeting in each commission district, 1 summer meeting at the admin building, and 1 public hearing to recommend a map to the BCC. And once that process is completed, the BCC takes up their work. There'll be a work session to explain the process and the maps to the BCC. Then the BCC will adopt the redistricting plans in February 22. That timeline which you see here, which we discussed earlier about this information being due to the board by January 14th, is based on the legislative session. So your plans are due by January 14th, and then it gives us enough time as staff to work through it and get an approval by our Board of County Commissioners, and we will need to be this has to be completed by early March when the legislative session starts in the state. In regards to the project team, we are broken in by our relative subject areas. I'm Jason. I'm assisted by Dan Kilpinen, who was doing the public comment. We're doing mainly the convening, logistics, and those related activities. You've all met Christina. Christina is the county attorney who's assisting us with this process. Obviously, Christina gets a lot and most of the hard questions, of which she is well equipped to handle. The fiscal and operation support, aka our tech folks, those are the ones who are working with the redistricting software, Maptitudes. That's Dean Salmons, who came up here earlier. Pete Johnstone, who is a veteran of this process. He worked on this in 2011. And Marissa Kordecki, also involved. Our communications division plays a vital role. They're the ones pushing this information out through the different channels, and the supervisor of elections. They're not an active partner, but they are working with us through the process, and of course they're the ones who are going to use this data after it's approved. In regards to community input, I know this topic has been brought up a lot. I want to emphasize how our process is, I wouldn't say unique, but somewhat special, in that many communities go through their redistricting process in a very closed setting where the municipality hires a consultant to create a map, and they see the map when it's being approved, or it's created internally by staff and it's seen when it's approved. Obviously, our process is anyone participating in this process through the many ways can get involved in the beginning and sit through 11 meetings to watch until a final map is created. So that's something that we're proud of, is we have a very public-facing process. Of course, we have public meetings, which you've heard about. The meetings are on Orange TV and social media, so if someone cannot or does not want to be here, they can sit comfortably in their home and watch the meetings. In regards to participation, we discussed the electronic public comment and how we plan to use that. And our public-facing tool to analyze the maptitudes, I'll talk a little bit about that, and that's important. In regards to public engagement, we have exercised as much as we can utilizing our communications division to make sure people are aware of this process and and know how to participate. So that's social media, newspapers, yes, print. We've put things in print so that as we've been talking about certain sections of our community, so they can be available to them, and also radio. So the resolution, which we've touched on a little bit, or you all touched on a little bit earlier, that creates the advisory committee, it was approved and executed unanimously by the Board of County Commissioners on August 24th. It names the members, lists the duties, responsibilities, and procedures, and details a deadline for recommendations to the board. So those are the high-level parts of the resolution. Per the resolution, there'll be one public meeting held in each commission district. We are striving to have public meetings in locations where CDC public health guidelines can be practiced. We're looking at our large gymnasiums that are through Orange County. The residents can provide public comment through meetings, and technology will be utilized to ensure an open, transparent, and fair forum for residents. In regards to the responsibilities of this body is to consider the applicable federal law, local law, and state law for traditional redistricting practices. So those are some of the things like preserving municipal boundaries and cores of districts, compactness, maintaining communities' interests, and consider incumbent interests. The maximum population difference between the largest and the smallest district has to be less than 10%. Christina's presentation, which is after mine, is going to go into far more depth into each of these topics. This is just a surface discussion. And to note, it's important to know that the Orange County requires there to be 6 commission districts. And again, that deadline that we are aiming towards is January 14th. Of course, the goal is, like our co-chairs have mentioned, is to be done before the holidays in December so that staff can keep working. In regards to membership, again, it's made up of 15 members. The mayor nominated 3 people, 2 of which were chosen as the co-chairs, and then two nominated by each commissioner. You must be members members must be currently and while they are on the committee, residents and electors of Orange County. So that means be able to vote in Orange County. And then anyone who's a candidate for commissioner in 2022 or someone intending to run is not eligible to serve on this committee. The co-chairs are the official spokespeople of the committee and the press and the media. Of course, all of you have your different platforms and your different communities of which you are gatekeepers and trusted voices. Certainly in those settings, please utilize your voices there to speak about the work. But in regards to the official spokespeople, those will be the co-chairs. If a member misses 3 of the regularly scheduled meetings, they will be removed from the committee. And in the event that happens, the nominating individual, whether that be the mayor or the commissioner, will select a replacement. That does require an action by the Board of County Commissioners. In the meetings, of course, they're open to the public, reasonable notice provided, and minutes will be taken. Each meeting, of course, will include public comment, which discussed that. We've already discussed this next part, that only a member can submit a proposed commission district boundary, and that anyone from the public has to go through you all to get the sponsor to move forward. Committee members may adjust other items be added to the agenda, but it does require an action by the board as spelled out in the resolution. In regards to the data, the census data for redistricting, was released very initially in a very raw form on August 12th. It's currently still being synthesized. Once the GIS team, who I introduced earlier, realized that they could get it to a certain point, we realized we could have meetings now. Originally, some of the early communications, we were not supposed to start until October. We realized that they have been doing an excellent job in moving forward, so we were able to start. There is a second release of the data, which comes next week, which will be more GIS friendly and provide some more of the geographic information that's required. So a high-level summary of the data is like the mayor said, our population increased from 1.15 million to 1.43 million, and we are the 6th in Florida for growth. Maptitude, which is the software that we've been discussing, allows users to create a redistricting plan for 6 commission districts. Users will see how changes will impact the population by moving the district. The program does have some tools built into it for contiguity, helping with assigning, helping with working with blocks that aren't assigned, and then confirming incumbents are still in their districts. Next meeting on the 27th, there will be a very lengthy tutorial and work session to go through everything and anything you would ever want to know about Maptitude and how it can be used. In regards to, there are some safeguards put in place. There will be warnings when users submit plans that have issues, such as the incumbent no longer lives in the district, and the plan would change the minority status of a district. Some of the considerations of the software are contiguous districts and deviation of population between districts. Some of these are legal, which Christina will talk about in her next presentation. What you see here is the residential development in Orange County in 2010. So this is a snapshot. What you see, those orange, or I guess yellow-orange areas there. What is shown here is the new development that came in a snapshot between 2010 and 2020. And as of course, you can see, those of you who are familiar with the county and where the growth occurs, you can see some areas that look familiar. And of course, the census that we just completed last year is meant to capture the growth, is meant to capture our population in a snapshot sense in 2020. And what is essentially what we heard people, I think someone mentioned before that they were part of the group who moved here between our census, moved between census between 2010 and 2020. That's what we're meant to be capturing. And this is the document which I think will drive most of your work going forward. Our population is 1.429 million people. When we divide that by 6, which is what we would consider the ideal district for a commission district, we get 238,318 people per district. And as you can see here, you have some districts that are what you would say over that amount, and some that are under that amount, or having more than that amount or less than that amount. And I would say that is the work of this commission district, this committee, is to redraw these boundaries as best as possible to make sure that these numbers work and meet some of the criteria which you will hear Christina speak about in depth in the next presentation. So a handful of takeaways just that are important. Again, the deadline is January 14th, 2022. Maptitude is the software that we will be using. Last year, when someone wanted to make a map, they had to come into this building and sit with staff, and that was a very time-intensive, a very labor-intensive process. Granted, so now that if someone has the ability and they're savvy enough, they can sit comfortably in their home or wherever they are and make a redistricting plan and work with you all to get it advanced. And of course, you all can do that as well. Again, last time when this effort was done, people had to sit with staff to make the maps. In regards to the redistricting webpage, that's www.ocfl.net/redistricting. That is the hub and the source of all of the information required for this process. So that has the schedule of all of the public meetings, the electronic public comment form, the resources. There'll be links to all the documents we've passed out, all of the information we've discussed in the meetings. So that's the hub of information. And of course, and then Kate Latour touched on this earlier with regards to the email address. OCFL.net email addresses will be created for all of the committee members. This is to help with what I would consider inevitable public records requests for your emails. If they are through the OCFL.net network, our IT staff can source that information and provide it to whoever's requesting it. If it's on your personal emails, then it's a little bit lengthy and I would say a more intrusive of a process. So I will be, I got the last piece of information I needed this evening to set that request. So we are strongly encouraging you to utilize this resource for everybody's sake in regards to using that ocfl.net email address. And that concludes my presentation. Are there any questions about what I discussed before we turn over to Christina?
Mayor Kilsheimer?
Just a quick question. Is this a web-based interface for OCFL email addresses or not?
I believe it will be web-based, yes. I don't think you need to download our entire system, so yes.
Okay.
Mr. Hoover?
Thank you. Did I hear you say that our deadline for submitting our plan or the board passing our plan is impacted by the start of the state legislative session?
Correct,
And did I hear you say that that begins in March?
yes.
No.
I think it
No, it
No, no,
begins,
no, that's not what he said.
Sorry, maybe I'm misunderstanding something.
It is impacted, our deadline is impacted by the state legislative session, which ends in March.
Sorry,
Okay,
hence,
thank
I
you.
apologize.
Thank you, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, and, sorry, I think everyone is done? Okay. Oh, yes, Mr. Jones.
Very succinct, and you're a great presenter.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jason.
Good evening.
Thank you, Ms. Barrios.
So as you already know, my name is Christina Barrios, and I'm the Assistant County Attorney that has been designated to provide the legal advice and guidance to the Redistricting Committee. And so I'd like to start by personally thanking everyone, and then immediately apologize for the length of this presentation. I know it's late, but it's quite dense information. And I really do look forward to working with each and every one of you and providing the legal guidance needed throughout this process. So without further ado, before we dive into the substance of this presentation, I have a few introductory notes. First, the purpose of the presentation is to provide an introduction to the legal requirements, concepts, and considerations that the committee must take into account when it is redistricting. The presentation is, again, as I said, very dense. It's comprised of 43 substantive slides with detailed information covering the fundamentals of redistricting, including applicable federal, state, and local law, as well as the best practice traditional redistricting principles that are generally encouraged and accepted by the courts. And questions will be taken at the end of this presentation, assuming we have time, but I also, anticipating that we might not, I'm encouraging the committee members to review the presentation that you have in front of you, listen to me give the presentation, and then submit questions to the redistricting@ocfl.net email address if you have any, and I can definitely compile those questions, respond to those questions in writing, and then provide answers to those questions and review them with the committee at our next meeting on September 27th. So that way we can go home or have the written documentation of the answers. And then there are footnotes throughout this presentation. They are superscript in orange, and they align with the references provided on the citation slides found at the end of the slide deck. And then any additional detailed supplemental legal information will be provided in writing by me as necessary. So this presentation is broken down into 4 parts. First is the background, really general. What is redistricting? When do we have to redistrict? Jason kind of went over that. Part B, redistricting considerations, where we're going to go more into the delicate balance between the various laws and principles of redistricting, including the federal, state, and local requirements. Part C, our legal challenges, so basically why and how people lodge legal challenges against counties or the state regarding redistricting plans, and then a brief conclusion. So starting with Part A, what is redistricting and how often must the county redistrict? Redistricting is the process of redrawing the geographic boundaries of districts from which public elected officials are elected, primarily for the purpose of rebalancing population. As such, it typically takes place after a decennial redistricting, and it applies to not just the county, but anywhere else that has districts, which is members of Congress, state legislatures, city councils, school boards, or all redistricting. Historically, up until the 1960s, many states and political subdivisions did not redistrict, so that led to an imbalance in their populations where the more densely populated areas were not significant, well, they're not represented because their vote power was significantly diluted. And so then in a series of 1960 cases of the Supreme Court, one of which coined the phrase "one person, one vote," which I will repeat several times through this presentation, the U.S. Supreme Court held that the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment guaranteed equality of voting power, and that the electoral systems in states and political subdivisions which failed to allocate voting power on the basis of population were unconstitutional. So how often must the county redistrict? As a matter of federal law, the county must redistrict after each decennial census, assuming that the districts are malapportioned by population. Additionally, both the Florida Constitution and the Orange County Charter require that the county decennial redistricts. The Florida Constitution says that we have to redistrict after every decennial census, and that we must divide the county into districts of contiguous territory as nearly equal in population as practicable. And the Orange County Charter relatively mirrors the state's language, but also says that there shall be 6 commission districts of contiguous territory as nearly equally in population as practicable. As the most recent decennial census was completed in 2020, the county must now complete its legally required decennial redistricting process. So redistricting considerations. We'll talk about how it's a delicate balance of different considerations: the federal equal population law, federal anti-discrimination law, the state and local contiguity requirement, and the traditional redistricting principles. The U.S. Supreme Court has recognized that redistricting requires a delicate balancing of competing considerations. As this presentation will further discuss, the applicable law assigns more weight to some of those competing considerations than to others. Ultimately, for the purposes of the county and this committee, such redistricting considerations should be made with the following priority in mind. First, federal equal population law. Second, federal anti-discrimination law. Third, the state and local contiguity requirement. And fourth, the traditional redistricting principles. So starting off with the federal equal population law, we'll talk about the one person, one vote principle and how to determine equal population. The one person, one vote principle was derived by the U.S. Supreme Court from the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. And it requires that states and political subdivisions make an honest and good faith effort to redraw their legislative districts with as nearly as equal population as is practicable. In short, the county's commission districts need to have substantial equality of population among them so that the vote of one citizen is approximately equal in weight to that of any other citizen. Note, the Florida Constitution and the Orange County Charter also require that the county draws its commission districts as nearly equal in population as practicable. So population equality is determined by calculating each commission district's deviation from the ideal district size, which Jason mentioned in his presentation. The county's ideal district size is determined by dividing the total population reported by the census, not the voting age population, the total population, by the 6 commission districts required by Section 202 of the Orange County Charter. So that would be what the formula would look like. Note, the county is permitted to allow its commission districts to have small deviations from the ideal district size in order to meet additional legal requirements, like the anti-discrimination requirements, and to follow other traditional redistricting principles. So how do we calculate district deviation from the ideal district size? And I will apologize again, there's going to be some math here, but the comfort knowing that the software will be doing that math for you, so I'm really just explaining the concepts to you. That will be provided to you through the software as you move the lines. First, you can calculate the absolute deviation that a district has from the ideal population size by subtracting the ideal district size from a district's population to get the absolute deviation. The relative deviation, you would divide a district's absolute deviation that you calculated above by the ideal district size and multiply by 100 to get the ratio or the percentage. The relative mean deviation, you would take the relative deviations of all the districts and average that. And then the maximum deviation, which is the most important in terms of court case law, which is the sum of the absolute values of the relative deviation of both the largest and smallest districts. And as I said, this is just conceptual. The software will do the math for you. Courts have held that the district boundary adjustments plans with maximum deviation under 10% presumptively comply with the one person, one vote principle. While the maximum deviation is used most often by the courts, they have found that the relative mean deviation is also useful. By example, in Gaffney v. Cummings, the U.S. Supreme Court found no prima facie case of Equal Protection Clause violation when a maximum deviation between challenged districts was 8% and the relative mean deviation was 2%. So I'm going to try and put this into a little bit more of an example so that you can see how it works out with the math, but again, just conceptually. To put this into practice, assume that the total population of the county is 600,000. That would make the ideal district size 100,000 because it's the total population divided by the 6 districts. So here is a draft template based on imaginary districts with numbers that neatly work out for the purposes of this presentation. You can see the district numbers going down the side, and you can see the district populations that are associated with those, with this pretend census results. So based on the example, the maximum deviation would be 8%, the sum of the absolute values of the relative deviations of the largest and smallest districts. So let's take the largest district, which in this is District 1, which has a positive 4% deviation from the ideal district. And then we would take the smallest district, which is District 6, which has a negative 4% deviation from the ideal district because it's 4% less. You would then add the absolute values of 4% plus negative 4% absolute value, and you would get 8% because absolute value is the distance from 0 that the number is, so it removes the negative effectively in front of negative numbers. The relative mean deviation, which again the courts also look at, would be 2.3% because it's the average of the absolute values of the relative deviations of all districts. So you would look at the relative deviation column and you would average out the absolute values of all of those numbers, which looks like that, divided by 6, and then you get the 2.3% relative mean deviation. These example districts would presumptively meet the one person, one vote principle because the maximum deviation is under that 10%, and the relative mean deviation shows that the variation between the districts on the average is not that large. So that was federal equal population law. Now we're moving into federal anti-discrimination law. This is a much bigger chunk of the presentation. We're going to talk about the Equal Protection Clause, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, majority-minority districts, the Gingell's preconditions, and the totality of the circumstances analysis. So starting with the Equal Protection Clause, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment prevents governments, in the absence of sufficient justification, from separating its citizens into different voting districts on the basis of race. In general, the Equal Protection Clause prohibits race or ethnicity from being the predominant factor motivating a state or political subdivision's decision to place a significant number of voters within or without a particular legislative district. If racial considerations are the predominant motivating factor of a state or political subdivision's redistricting plan, then the redistricting plan must withstand strict scrutiny analysis, and I know we have lots of attorneys on this committee, going back to constitutional law, in order to state or in order for the state or political subdivision to not be found in violation of the equal protection clause by the courts. This strict scrutiny analysis requires that the state or political subdivision prove that its race-based sorting of the population serves a compelling interest and is narrowly tailored to that end. In regards to this required strict scrutiny analysis, the U.S. Supreme Court has held, and this is quite relevant, that complying with the operative provisions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, also referred to in the presentation as the VRA, as amended, is a compelling interest, and that race-based districting is narrowly tailored to that compelling interest if a state or political subdivision had a strong basis in evidence for thinking such race-based districting was demanded by the VRA. So long as the state or political subdivision passes this strict scrutiny analysis, it has the sufficient justification needed to draw its district boundaries based on race. Note, the strong basis in evidence standards provides breathing room to states and political subdivisions to adopt reasonable compliance measures that may prove in hindsight not to have been needed. Moving on to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which will be referred to in the presentation as VRA Section 2, is the key provision regarding redistricting. VRA Section 2 prohibits all states and political subdivisions from denying or abridging any U.S. citizen's right to vote on account of race, color, or status as a member of a language minority group. Note, Congress has defined language minorities and language minority group to specifically mean persons who are American Indian, Asian American, Alaskan Natives, or of Spanish heritage. A voting practice or procedure violates VRA Section 2 if, based on the totality of the circumstances, it provides a minority population with less opportunity than other members of the electorate to participate in the political process and to elect representatives of their choice. Relevant to the county's redistricting efforts, VRA Section 2 prohibits the use of voting practices or procedures, including redistricting plans, that result in minority vote dilution. Minority vote dilution refers to the redistricting plans and other voting practices that minimize or cancel out the voting strength of a racial or language minority. Two techniques frequently used to impermissibly dilute minority voting strength are cracking, which is the fragmenting of the concentrations of minority population and dispersing them into other districts to ensure that all districts are majority white, or packing, which is concentrating minority population into as few districts as possible to minimize the number of majority-minority districts. While the VRA protects against minority vote dilution, it also expressly states that it does not establish a right to have members of a minority population elected in numbers equal to their proportion of the population. The ultimate right provided by VRA Section 2 is equality of opportunity, not a guarantee of electoral success for minority-preferred candidates. Majority-minority districts. For the purpose of preventing minority vote dilution, VRA Section 2 may require that the state or political subdivision draw majority-minority districts. A majority-minority district is one where a particular minority group's voting age population, as refined by citizenship, comprises more than 50% of the potential district's population. In determining whether such majority-minority districts should have been drawn by a state or political subdivision in order to avoid violating VRA Section 2's prohibition against minority vote dilution, the courts review three preconditions, known as the Gingell's preconditions, which I will talk about shortly, and perform a totality of the circumstances analysis. Note, While VRA Section 2 may require that a state or political subdivision racially draws district lines in order to create majority-minority districts to prevent minority vote dilution, it does not require states or political subdivisions to maximize the possible number of majority-minority districts, create minority influence districts, or provide minority voters an electoral advantage. To pass the strict scrutiny analysis required to racially draw district boundaries without violating the Equal Protection Clause, states or political subdivisions must conclude, based on strong basis and evidence, that creation of a majority-minority district is necessary to comply with VRA Section 2, and that such race-based districting will substantially address the potential VRA Section 2 violation. This is accomplished by asking the following question. Does the state or political subdivision have a strong basis and evidence to believe that a plaintiff challenging its redrawn districts in court would be able to establish that all three of the Gingell's preconditions existed in any of its districts? If yes, then the state or political subdivision has good reason to believe that the creation of the majority-minority district was required by VRA Section 2 to prevent minority vote dilution. If no, then the state or political subdivision would not have good reason to believe that the creation of a majority-minority district was required by VRA Section 2 to prevent minority vote dilution. So what are these Gingell's preconditions? The three preconditions used by the courts to determine whether a violation of VRA Section 2 for minority vote dilution exists are known as the Gingell's preconditions. They are as followed. Number 1, the minority group must be sufficiently large and geographically compact enough to constitute a majority in a reasonably configured district. Number 2, the minority group must be politically cohesive. And number 3, the white majority must vote sufficiently as a bloc to usually defeat the minority population's preferred candidate. If all three Gingell's preconditions are established, the courts then perform a totality of the circumstances analysis to determine whether members of the minority group in question actually have less opportunity than do other members of the electorate to elect representatives of their choosing. Going into Gingell's precondition number 1, the first Gingell's precondition tests whether a minority population is sufficiently large and geographically compact enough to constitute a majority in a reasonably configured district by asking, is it possible to draw a reasonably configured district so that a majority of the voting age population belongs to a geographically compact racial or language minority community? The proper statistic for determining if a minority group in a potential district is sufficiently large and geographically compact is whether that minority group's voting age population, refined by citizenship, is greater than 50%. If the minority population is so dispersed that a reasonably compact majority-minority district cannot be created, then VRA Section 2 does not require the creation of majority-minority districts. Compact, in regards to the first Gingell's precondition, refers to the compactness of the minority population, not the compactness of the contested district, and should take into account traditional redistricting principles, such as maintaining communities of interest and traditional boundaries, each of which will be further discussed later in this presentation. State and political subdivisions may not engage in racial stereotyping by assuming, based on a group's voters' race or language minority group status, that they think alike, share the same political interests, and will prefer the same candidates at the polls. Instead, states and political subdivisions should use non-racial factors to determine whether such minority group is a community of interest. Such factors include socioeconomic status, education, employment, health, and other characteristics between members of that minority group. So some Supreme Court examples: in League of United Latin American Citizens versus Perry, the U.S. Supreme Court reviewed a district created by the state of Texas where there was a 300-mile gap between the Latino communities in the district and a similarly large gap between the needs and interests of the two groups. This is what that district looked like. The court found that Texas had no basis to believe that the district, which was not compact and combined two far-flung segments of a racial group with disparate interests, was required by VRA Section 2, or that the first Gingos precondition had been established. Accordingly, the court found that District 25 had been impermissibly drawn. And I just got a note that the parking garage closes at 10 p.m. So it is 9:40 is what this says. So you might need to we might need to take a break so that the cars can get moved out of the parking garage if you're parked in the parking garage.
Do we have any members who are parked in the parking garage? Would you like us to hold off on the proceedings while you do that?
You continue, please, since it's in writing right here.
Is there anyone else?
I'm parked in front of the building. Are they going to tow me? No?
No,
Okay.
but the parking garage will close.
Mr. Jones, thank you.
Please continue.
Thank
And I
you.
can read to catch up.
Ms. Barrios.
Okay, moving to the next slide. In Bush v. Vera, the Supreme Court reviewed 3 districts drawn by the state of Texas. These are what they looked like. 2 were African American and 1 was an Hispanic district. There, the court found that because the districts drawn in order to satisfy VRA Section 2 must not be subordinate to traditional redistricting principles, to race substantially more than is reasonably necessary to avoid VRA Section 2 liability, all 3 districts were unconstitutional. So effectively, the districts that you saw, which were squiggly lines, did not follow any kind of traditional redistricting principles of being compact or going by political subdivision lines. They were all just squiggly tendrils. And so that can't be subordinated to the racial concerns, so all 3 districts were deemed unconstitutional. Noting the irregularity and shape of each district, the court reasoned that race-based redistricting cannot be justified unless the state or political subdivision employs sound redistricting principles and the affected racial groups' residential patterns afford the opportunity of creating districts in which they will be the majority. Essentially, if because of dispersion of the minority population, a reasonably compact majority-minority district cannot be created, VRA Section 2 does not require a majority-minority district. Moving on to Gingos Precondition 2. The second Gingos Precondition inquires as to whether the minority population is politically cohesive by asking, does the racial or language minority population usually vote as a bloc for the same type of candidates? As discussed with the first Gingos Precondition, you can't use racial stereotypes, and you have to look at factors that bind the minority group past just the fact that they are part of the same minority group. If there's meaningful diversity of political preference in the minority population, then it would not be considered politically cohesive, and the second Gingos precondition would not be met. Gingos precondition number 3. If the minority population is politically cohesive, the third Gingos precondition inquires as to the extent, if any, that minority population submergence in the white majority population impedes its ability to elect its chosen representatives. It does this by asking whether, does the white majority in the district vote sufficiently as a bloc to usually defeat the minority population's preferred candidate? The usual predictability of a white majority's success distinguishes structural dilution from mere loss of occasional elections. So you would have to say that the district predictably will always vote for a white candidate over that historically, that is predictable, that they would vote for a white candidate over the minority population's preferred candidate. In the absence of effective white bloc voting, then the third Gingos condition cannot be met. Note, combined, the second and third Gingos preconditions establish whether there is racially polarized voting in the relevant geographic area. In Cooper v. Harris, which was decided in 2017, I believe, The U.S. Supreme Court reviewed the state of North Carolina's drawing of 2 African-American majority-minority congressional districts after a 2010 census. That was District 12 and District 1. The state defended District 12's majority-minority configuration by arguing that it was not racially drawn, that instead they drew the population based on partisan, which is permitted under the Supreme Court's case law, and basically because certain minority populations tend to vote more Democratic than not, that it just happened to turn into a majority-minority district. It wasn't their intention. However, the lower court, based on evidence, decided that race, not politics, impermissibly accounted for the District 12 majority-minority reconfiguration. The state defended District 1's a little differently. It admitted that it drew District 1's configuration based on racial lines, but it argued that it did so in order to comply with the requirements of VRA Section 2, and that's how the third Gingell's precondition came into effect. Based on the results of the 2010 census, the state needed to add almost 100,000 people to District 1 to comply with the one person, one vote principle. It did so by racially drawing the district boundaries to include additional African American populations. The court found that the state could not demonstrate effective white bloc voting in the geographically relevant area. Instead, historical evidence showed that the areas in District 1 that have been drawn had historically had a lot of white crossover voting. Consequently, the court found that the state lacked the strong basis in evidence it needed to conclude that the VRA Section 2 demanded the race-based drawing of a majority-minority district and held that the third Gingell's precondition was not established. And again, that's because there was history in the area of the minority population's preferred candidates winning because the white majority was voting in line with some of the preferences, or part of the white majority was voting in line with the preferences of the minority population. The court also reasoned that the prospect of a significant population increase in a district only does not answer the question of whether VRA Section 2 requires deliberate measures to augment the district's black voting age population. To have a strong basis in evidence to conclude that VRA Section 2 demands such race-based steps, the state or political subdivision must carefully evaluate whether a plaintiff could establish the Gingell's preconditions in a new district created without those measures. So, Gingell's preconditions in practice. In Rios Andino v. Orange County, a group of plaintiffs challenged the 2011 redistricting plan adopted by the Orange County Board of County Commissioners in federal court. And so that was the plan that we adopted 10 years ago. There, the plaintiff argued that the county's 2011 redistricting plan violated VRA Section 2 by diluting the voting strength of the county's Latino citizens, most specifically in District 3. The court analysis. Gingell's precondition number 1. In coming to its decision, the court reviewed whether the plaintiffs established that the Latino voting age population refined by citizenship in District 3 was sufficiently large and geographically compact enough to constitute a majority in a single-member district. The court found that the Latino voting age population refined by citizenship in the geographically relevant area was under 50% of the population. It was 46.4 or 48% depending on the maps and evidence. Accordingly, the court concluded that because the plaintiffs could not demonstrate that the geographically relevant Latino voting age population refined by citizenship exceeded 50% of the population in a reasonably drawn district, the plaintiffs had not successfully established the first precondition for Gingell's. Court analysis for Gingell's condition number 3. The court then reviewed whether the plaintiffs could establish the existence of a majority block voting that regularly caused the candidate preferred by the Latino voters to lose. There, the court found historical evidence showed that Latinos had been able to win county commissioner elections in District 3 even when Latino voters comprised a smaller share of District 3's electorate than it did after the 2011 adoption, specifically in the 2002 and 2004 elections. The court additionally considered other explanations that arose at trial for Latino candidates' lack of success in the more recent county commissioner elections, including low Latino turnout relative to voter registration. The court ultimately held that because the plaintiffs could not demonstrate that racially polarized block voting regularly caused the geographically relevant Latino population's candidates of choice to be defeated, the plaintiffs could not establish the third Gingell's precondition. In conclusion, the federal court found that the plaintiffs failed to prove by preponderance of the evidence that the Latino population in Orange County was sufficiently large enough and geographically compact enough to constitute a majority in a single-member district, thus failing to establish Gingell's condition number 1, and that a non-Latino majority voted sufficiently as a bloc to enable it to usually defeat the Latino population's preferred candidates in the county commissioner elections, thus failing to establish Gingell's precondition number 3. Accordingly, the court entered a final judgment providing that the plaintiffs were not entitled to any relief on their claims and that the county would recover its costs for the civil action. In sum, Gingell's preconditions: to have a strong basis of evidence to conclude that the VRA Section 2 demands race-based drawing of districts, a state or political subdivision must carefully evaluate whether a plaintiff could establish all 3 of the Gingell's preconditions in a new, reasonably configured district without those measures. According to the U.S. Supreme Court, unless a plaintiff can establish that each of the 3 Gingell's preconditions existed when the state or political subdivision redrew its districts, there's neither been no wrong and nor can there be a remedy. If the political subdivision has a strong basis and evidence for concluding that, based on all 3 Gingell's preconditions, race-based drawing of districts is reasonably necessary to comply with VRA Section 2 to avoid minority vote dilution, and districting that is race-based substantially addresses the VRA Section 2 violation, it satisfies the strict scrutiny analysis. And you have to have all 3 Gingell's preconditions met, because if any of the ones are not met, then the political subdivision or state would be in violation of the Equal Protection Clause if race is found by the court to be a predominant factor motivating the drawing of its district boundaries. The totality of the circumstances analysis. So even after all of those 3 Gingell's preconditions are established, the courts must still then consider the totality of the circumstances to determine whether members of a minority population have less opportunity than do others of the electorate to participate in the political process and to elect representatives of their choice. The Senate report on the 1982 amendments to the Voting Rights Act provides a non-exhaustive list of totality of the circumstances factors typically relevant to the VRA Section 2 claim that the courts interpret and apply. These factors include the extent of any history or of official discrimination in the state or political subdivision that touched that minority's members' right to vote, register, or otherwise participate in the democratic process, the extent to which voting in elections of state or political subdivisions is racially polarized, if there's a candidate slating process, whether the members of the minority group have been denied access to that process, to the extent which the state or political subdivision has unusually large election districts, majority vote requirements, anti-single shot provisions, or other voting practices or procedures that may enhance the opportunity for discrimination against a minority group, the extent to which members of the minority group in the state or political subdivision bear the effects of discrimination in areas such as education, employment, and health, which hinder their ability to participate effectively in the political process, whether political campaigns have been characterized by overt or subtle racial appeals, and the extent to which members of the minority group have been elected to public office in the jurisdiction. Additional factors that the Senate report identified as having probative value in some cases regarding a plaintiff's evidence to establish VRA Section 2 are whether there is significant lack of responsiveness on the part of elected officials to the particularized needs of the members of the minority group, and whether the policy underlying a state or political subdivision's use of such voting qualification, prerequisite to voting, or standard practice or procedure is tenuous. There is no requirement that any particular number of factors be proved or that a majority of them be proved, one way or the other. Instead, the question whether a political process are equally open depends upon searching practical evaluation of the past and present reality, and on a functional view of the political process. So it's very court-driven based on their findings on the record. Moving on to the state and local contiguity requirement, the contiguous territory requirement. Contiguity is a traditional redistricting principle with which the county is required to comply pursuant to both the Florida Constitution and the Orange County Charter. The Florida Supreme Court has defined contiguous as being an actual contact touching along a boundary or a point. So you see, one district would not be contiguous because it doesn't touch, and the other one would be contiguous, though the other one's not compact. The Florida Supreme Court has defined contiguous as being an actual contact touching along the boundary or a point. A district lacks contiguity when a part is isolated from the rest of the territory or another district, or when the lands mutually touch only at a common corner or right angle. So they actually have to touch in a way that you could pass through them. They can't just be corners of each other. The presence in a district of a body of water without a connecting bridge, even if it necessitates land travel, does not violate contiguity. So you could have no way of driving through the district, but it could still be considered contiguous under the Florida's definition, as long as it's all touching. So now we're moving into traditional redistricting principles. Generally, and then we'll go into compactness, preservation of municipal boundaries, preservation of core and prior districts, maintaining communities' interests, and additional considerations. And I will let you know that we are way more than halfway through this, so.
Ms. Barrios, can I interrupt a second?
I saw you
I need
bending.
to impose on the co-chair. We need a co-chair motion and a vote of the board to extend this meeting for another 20 minutes?
It depends on how much questioning the
All right,
committee-
30 minutes, another 30 minutes. So
I concur.
we have a motion and a concurrence from the co-chair to extend the meeting for another 30 minutes.
Do we need a second?
I think it's just a motion from us.
Okay.
But we do need to vote. So all in favor of that motion, please say aye.
Aye.
And opposed. Thank you. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Not a problem. So generally, while the federal requirement and applicable state and local laws have the highest priority, there are longstanding traditional redistricting principles that states and political subdivisions should consider when drawing district boundaries. Unless they're specifically required by state or local law, like the contiguity in the county's case, the county is not legally required to follow these traditional redistricting principles. However, they are considered to be best practices by the courts. Moreover, the U.S. Supreme Court has emphasized that states and political subdivisions should still take these traditional redistricting principles into consideration when redrawing their district boundaries, as they are objective factors that can assist such states and political subdivisions in defeating a claim in court alleging that its districts were impermissibly racially gerrymandered. So basically, going back to what we were talking about with the federal anti-discrimination rules, the way that you can argue, no, we didn't racially gerrymander at all, is that we were following municipal lines, or we were following the compactness principle, or we were making sure that we're protecting the core districts. And we'll go into what all those mean. But the Supreme Court looks at that, and if you're deviating from that, they have a more suspicious eye in terms of assuming that the reason why you deviated or why the county would have deviated from following those redistricting principles was because of race or some kind of other impermissible thing that we were doing to try and use race as a proxy. Compactness. So the first traditional redistricting principle is compactness. It refers to the principle that constituents residing within an electoral district should live near to one another as possible. While compactness can be measured as a ratio of the circumference of a district and its total area, in practice, the courts just tend to use an eyebrow approach. Basically, does the district look compact? First, you'll have a non-compact district, and then you'll have a compact district below. Non-compact districts are irregular in shape with tendrils or non-contiguous segments. Such districts can appear somewhat like a river on a map. Typically, they are much longer than they are wide. Compact districts look more densely packed and tend to resemble geometric shapes, such as squares and rectangles and straight borders. Non-compact districts, again, have been used in courts as evidence that a state or political subdivision may have acted impermissibly in drafting or adopting its redistricting plan. And if you kind of remember back on what we were talking about, when we were talking about Gingell's number 1, those maps that failed the Gingell's number 1 test all had these tendrils and kind of wiggled around other populations. And so the court said, well, the only reason why you would do that is because of race. You're collecting all these different racial populations, and that's not permitted. Second, you go into preservation of municipal boundaries. Citizens that live in specific cities or towns are more likely to have shared political interests and common concerns. The preservation of municipal boundaries principle refers to avoiding or minimizing the division of cities or towns among different commission districts when drawing district boundaries. Unlike some other principles, this principle can be quantified by measuring the number of cities or towns that are split between 2 or more commission districts. And this principle is accepted by the courts as a traditional redistricting principle. We do have currently several splits of jurisdictions that were unavoidable last year. Of course, Orlando's population is split across many districts. So we'll get you that information when we're talking more about the mapping software to show you where those splits are. Preservation of cores of prior districts. Boundary adjustments lead to the number of constituents being moved into districts with incumbent representatives that they did not elect. While redistricting by its very nature requires changing boundaries, the goal of preserving the cores of existing districts is to minimize the number of constituents impacted by boundary adjustments. In short, continuity of district leads to continuity of representation for the citizens. Based on this principle, the redistricting process typically will begin with our existing map, and then we'll make changes from that existing map to do the balancing of population and meet our other goals, rather than just starting with a blank slate and not really caring which district the citizens are in, because we want to make sure that the citizens that have voted a certain commissioner to the greatest extent possible are not impacted. And so this principle is also accepted by the courts as a traditional redistricting principle. Maintaining communities of interest. Generally, communities of interest are geographic areas, such as neighborhoods of a city or regions of a county or state where residents have common political interests. So one such community of interest would be Orlo Vista, as was discussed by our public comment earlier, saying they don't want their neighborhood split up. That's the kind of consideration that's going here. It's a permissible consideration to say, you know, this community really doesn't want to get split up between 2 commission districts, so trying to minimize the splits of those communities. Typically, communities, as presented by the census, are broken down into designated census places. And so that's typically how we identify communities through the mapping software and through the census. And the mapping software will let us know when we split these census designated communities across different districts, and trying to minimize that is an objective that is an important one, just making sure, as you heard from the public comment, a community likes to have one representative, not several, for when they have their issues come through. Communities of interest do not necessarily coincide with boundaries of municipalities or political subdivisions. Instead, they generally identify, if they're not these neighborhoods, with socioeconomic status, economic activity, social community, or housing commonalities. The U.S. Supreme Court has really not provided a precise definition as to community of interest, but it does recognize certain types of community of interest that can involve the land use. Is it urban? Is it agricultural? Similar standards of living, similar work opportunities, use of transportation system, shared media outlets, They're all factors that could identify a community of interest that the committee may not want to split up. However, community of interest cannot be used as proxy for race, and a lot of those things can cross over with race in terms of shared media outlets, for example. And so we can't use it as a proxy, so we have to be careful that when we're talking about these community of interest, that we're not just trying to gerrymander based on race to create some kind of racial district that's not supportable by the Gingo's consideration and all the federal anti-discrimination law we just talked about earlier. Consideration of incumbents. So, pursuant to Section 203 of the Orange County Charter, each commissioner shall be a registered voter and resident of the particular district he or she represents at the time of election to office and throughout the term in office. So if we redraw the lines and we move a commissioner out of their district, the committee would be putting them into conflict with the Orange County Charter. They would either have to move to get back into their district. That would be typically what would happen. So typically we try to avoid doing that. The courts have held that incumbency protection considerations can be a legitimate factor in redistricting. However, the question of how much weight this consideration should receive is based on whether or not the incumbency protection is in the interest of the constituents. So if the justification is keeping the constituency intact so that the office holder is accountable for the promises made or broken, then the protection aligns with the concerns of the voter. So if we move one of the commissioners out of their district by just kind of moving a couple of census blocks over, we are now changing the representative of everyone else remaining in that district. And so that's kind of goes back also to core districts and trying to make sure that we're mitigating the impact on the residents as little as possible. However, if incumbency protection means excluding some voters from districts simply because they're likely to vote against an incumbent, that would not be a legitimate thing for us to consider. So some additional considerations. These are just random things that you may have heard about redistricting. First of all, the use of traditional redistricting principles as a proxy for race is not permitted. If the court suspects that such has occurred, they'll go through the strict scrutiny analysis. While Orange County elections for office of commissioner are nonpartisan, the courts have upheld redistricting based on party affiliation. But again, that doesn't really impact us very much because we have nonpartisan commission districts. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 also includes another section that, based on Shelby County v. Holder, was basically thrown out by the Supreme Court. It doesn't really impact us. We were never one of those pre-clearance districts with the Department of Justice under Section 5, but it's just something that has definitely been floating around in the news, so I just wanted to make a point to say that. And then the Fair District Amendments, also something that kind of floats around, which are in Section 20 and 21 of the Florida Constitution that set forth the standards that the Florida legislature must follow when establishing congressional and state legislative district boundaries. They don't apply to the Orange County Commission district or districting process. They're just for the state at the congressional apportionment and legislative and their own personal legislative districts. So they don't really apply to us. They talk about partisanship, which again doesn't apply to us because we don't have partisan elections, that we cannot consider the incumbents, which we do, and again, that doesn't apply to us, and just some other requirements that don't get passed on to us because it's not in that portion of the Constitution. So, legal challenges. Who can file a complaint and what are the reasons a complaint might be filed? The following have standing to file a complaint challenging the districts adopted by the Orange County Board of County Commissioners. Any resident in the challenged district, any non-resident who can prove that the boundary adjustment plan causes them irreparable injury, the U.S. Department of Justice, which just released some guidance on redistricting at the beginning of September, which reminded the readers that the majority of their cases are against local governments. And then Such challenges are typically heard in federal court, but the state courts may also address them as well. And then what are the reasons a complaint might be filed? Complaints regarding redistricting may be filed for various reasons, the two most prominent being that the state or political subdivision failed to comply with the requirements of the Voting Rights Act, Section 2, when required, violated the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause by either failing to meet the one person, one vote equal population principle, or using race as a predominant factor when drawing its legislative district boundaries without being required to by the VRA Section 2. And in conclusion, it's a delicate balancing act and some questions. So to review, the Supreme Court recognized that redistricting requires delicate balancing of competing interests. This presentation discussed the applicable laws, which assign more weight to some than others of the competing considerations. Ultimately, for the purposes of the county and this committee, the priority in mind should be the federal equal population law, the federal anti-discrimination law, state and local contiguity requirement, and the traditional redistricting principles. And so that is the end of the presentation. Again, if committee members want to email me questions after kind of digesting the information, I am happy to respond to those emails and review the answers to them at our next meeting, and I'll take any immediate questions right now.
Are there any pressing questions right now? Yes.
Just one real quick question to clarify for everybody's reference. We are using specifically the 2020 census data, and we are not allowed to forecast growth or anything like that. We're required to use the numbers provided to us, correct?
So we are required to use numbers that are given to us by the census, but we can project out if we know there's going to be a substantial amount of growth. For example, if we know that there's going to be thousands of houses in the Lake Nona area or in the Horizons West area, it might be wise to consider that when doing some of the populations, but we don't have that data, so it really is safer to just deal with the population numbers that they are. Would it be a permissible consideration? Most certainly. Is it one that it should be a driving consideration? Probably not.
Other questions? Yes, go ahead, Kelly.
I had two questions. The first is, can we please get the absolute and relative deviations for each of the current districts?
That was actually in a map that Jason showed in his presentation, and we could definitely upload that and send that out to you.
Okay, thank you. And then secondly, I just wanted to confirm that the districts that are up for re-election, where we would be concerned about district commissioners not being within their district, are 5, 6, and 3, 5, and 6. Is that right? They're termed out?
No, I believe 3 can run again.
I think that
It's 2, 4, and 6.
2, 4, and 6. No, I think
I don't think they're all
Sipplin
termed
is-
out because 4 can run again. So
They're
it's
not termed out, but they're up for election.
they're up for re-election, yeah.
Okay, so, I mean, the ones who are termed out.
6
And 5.
and 5, yeah.
But not for the purposes of what we're considering.
But also in terms of the question of being termed out, those would be the districts that are termed out, but we are adopting these maps in 2022. So any commissioner that would be running in 2024, who it might be terming out, but not this year, not in 2022, would be susceptible as well.
correct.
Okay.
They essentially have to be able to live in the district where they're.
Yes, you have to live in the district. It's not just about running in the district when you're elected. It's also continuing to live for the entire term. Plus, the commissioners will be the ones finally adopting the map that you propose. So I don't know if they're going to want to.
Other
vote out
questions
one of
on
themselves.
that end? Anything? Nothing? Nothing. Thank you.
Of course.
That was a lengthy and substantive presentation. Okay, we extended the meeting. We have 16 more minutes if we want to use them. I think I know the answer to that. However, I think before we adjourn, I would like to just ask if anyone has any thoughts for the good of the order. I will tell you, I very much enjoyed this first meeting. I think we're going to work together well. And I'm very optimistic that this is going to happen. Mark?
Thank everyone for their patience, including the chairs.
Great. Madam Chair, anything else?
No, I think this was a great first meeting. I think the process we've undertaken thus far shows that, number one, we have a lot of good, smart people on this committee who are prepared to dissect difficult issues and bring the interests that they have in mind to voice, their voices here, and I appreciate that. I appreciate those of you who are still here. I know this is going to be a long process and a late process, but it's required for our community, for our ability to serve our community for what we've been appointed for. So thanks to each of you for taking this task on, and I look forward to us doing a fair and transparent process and bringing everything forward.
And by way of transparency, we will let you know, Camille and I are meeting with each of the commissioners in the next 2 weeks, just to update them. What's it? And the mayor, to update them on this meeting and where we're going, and to listen to their concerns. They're posted meetings. They are in the sunshine. Many of them are tomorrow. So, just so you know. Do I hear a motion to adjourn?
I so move.
Got a
Just real-
motion to, go.
Just real quick, I wanted to say thank you to the staff and the co-chairs for getting us to this point. There's been a tremendous amount of work. I just want to say thank you.
Thank you. I heard a motion to adjourn
Second.
and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
And opposed? Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, staff. Great job tonight.